man. Thanks for joining our table. A little late. Hey, most of you know by now that Martha and I have renovated a few homes. And if you come to our house, there are a couple channels that are locked in on our TV. One is HGTV and the other one is DIY. And so Martha, more than me, loves a project. And one of the things that she loves most about a project is transforming something from what it is to what it could be. And so she sees it, and she just loves chasing after it. And that's essentially what we've been doing for the past 6 weeks as we've been talking about biblical hospitality. This whole series was designed in an effort to help reclaim getting around the table as an important practice as a follower of Jesus. And we wanted to create this vision of what could be, of what should be. And so this hasn't been just a series for us. We know that we're in process here. And we wanted to help kind of bring this to at least challenge you for it to be an important part of your life. It's an invitation from us. It's an exhortation from your pastors in this area. And so we believe that if 7 Marks is going to make an impact in our city, in our nation, our world, then this is going to be part of it, right? We are going to practice mark number 4 of 7 Marks, that a disciple is one who engages in biblical community with the practice of hospitality being part of that. And so what we wanted to do this morning, we figured we would close out this series together and around the table. And so you've heard from each of us during this series. So Caleb is our student ministry pastor. Tyler is our discipleship pastor, and then Josh is our worship pastor. And I love these guys. I believe in these guys. And I feel it's part of my responsibility in leading forward that you as our church family hear from all of us, because we are all a work in progress. And so as we grow, we want to encourage you to grow as followers of Jesus. And so we're excited about kind of concluding this series. In this past week, we were talking about it together. And we have all stated, like, this series has really challenged us and convicted us in many ways. And this series has been aspirational for us. Like, we haven't mastered this, right? This is something that we intend to continue to grow and lead the way in. And so Tyler, I know he's done the lion's share of the research for this series. And Tyler, beyond us knowing that this is something that Jesus practiced and that we should adopt, statistically and research proves, like, this is a big deal to get around the table. So why don't you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things you should know before I answer that question about me is I have always had kind of a functional relationship with food. I eat because if I don't, I'll die. And that's basically it. It's not a big priority for me. I mean, I like a good steak, but the best steak is one somebody else has made. I don't like to cook. I don't spend much time in the kitchen. It is nothing for me to forget to eat a meal or two during the day because I'm just engrossed in what I'm doing. And
never had that problem.
Most people don't. But the point in me telling you that is my relationship, my view of food has, for most of my life, impacted my view of the table. It's just never really been that much of a priority for me. And so all that kind of began to change last year at the outset of the pandemic. Like most of you, the circle of people that I engaged with got really small really quickly. But unlike most of you probably, most of my family is all right down the road from me. And so somewhat spontaneously, we just started to gather just about every night to share a meal around the table. And it was to discuss the news of the day and our fears and concerns. We'd arm wrestle for a roll of toilet paper. It was just, you remember the early days of the pandemic. And so it was nothing for months, 4 or 5 nights a week for us to share a meal together.
So the important part is, like, did you ever cook any of those meals?
Literally not one time. Literally not one time. But it still didn't dawn on me how important the table was until life started to kind of fill back in again, right? You get busier, restrictions start loosening up a bit, schedule starts to fill back in, and we stopped meeting as frequently around the table. And that's when it dawned on me how much I missed it, and just how much I had missed what the point of the table is for in the first place. There's something kind of magic that happens when people gather regularly around the table. And if you don't believe me, listen to this study from Columbia University a few years ago where they say that they found that children who eat dinner with their parents 5 or more times a week have less trouble with drugs and alcohol, they tend to eat healthier, they tend to show better academic performance, and report being closer with their parents than children who eat with their parents less often. And so what's up with that? What's going on with that and the table? Well, it's Charles Duhigg who first introduced me to this concept of the keystone habit in his book, The Power of Habit, New York Times bestseller a few years ago. And he says basically that some habits are far more important to establish than others. Some habits are far more fundamental to your life than others because they have the power to start chain reactions in your life that over time impact everything else. And so he says success doesn't depend on getting everything right, but instead relies on identifying a few key priorities and fashioning them into powerful levers. One of the most interesting examples of this from habit literature is actually just bed making. See, for a lot of people, the simple practice of waking up in the morning and bringing order to chaos in making your bed has the chance to spiral upward into all kinds of better reports of productivity and well-being and discipline in other areas of life. But way more interesting for our purposes today is Duhigg's example of the table, families eating around the table as a keystone habit. He writes, it's not that a family meal causes things like better grades or more positive mental health or whatever, but somehow those initial shifts start a chain reaction that helps other good habits take hold. But the truth is that the modern American family just does not eat together around the table much anymore. About 20% of us eat a meal regularly on the go and in the car. 25% of people get a meal every day, at least once, from fast food restaurants. In fact, most Americans, more than half now, spend as much, if not more, on fast food than they spend at the grocery store.
All right, time out. So how many of you spend more money on fast food than you do on your grocery bill? Let me see your hand. Oh, look, we have some people that admit. The rest of you are not admitting it, okay? You're just not admitting that's true.
Maybe we just have some people who are above average, right?
Maybe.
So here's the point. About 17% of families now regularly gather around the table for a meal. But most of the time, they do so gathered around the TV. And we have efficiently gotten the amount of time that we spend together eating down to about 12 minutes. Now, I say all that, and some of it's obvious, the reasons for it. Some of them are actually understandable. A growing number of families don't look like they used to, or this is maybe a single-parent household, and life's just crazy busy. For a lot of other families, it's just not reasonable anymore to have a spouse who stays at home and worries about the kiddos and cooking and things like that. And modern life demands that you have 2 parents in the home working, and that means driving, that means commuting, and the last thing you want to do after working all day and getting home and dealing with the kiddos is spending 30 or 45 minutes cooking. That means dishes and cleanup, and that doesn't even say anything at all about how busy kids are these days. And so the point of saying all of that is just to say this. I understand as well as anybody just how hard it is in the modern world to prioritize the table. But it's precisely because it's never been harder than it is right now that I think it's never been more important than it is right now to recapture the power of the table as a transformative and life-giving habit for our families. See, we've known for a long time that families are fundamental building blocks of society. Society goes as the family goes. And it seems that the table is the place where families grow strong. Because it's the place, it may be the last place where we regularly come together to connect, to grow, to share our lives, and to be changed. And so perhaps it's fair to actually say that society goes as families go, and families rise or fall based on how they view the table. But the last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it back over to you, is I'm not just saying that we should reclaim the table so that kids can get better grades and so that our mental health can be better. As good as those things are, and as much as I want those things for my family, just like you do for yours. What I'm advocating for and what I want for my own life is to reclaim the table as a keystone habit, as a powerful lever for this thing we're going to talk about today, and that's family discipleship.
And so what could be more important than helping our families follow Jesus? And for years we have talked about it around here that we understand that we don't hold the primary role of discipling your family, your kids, right? God has given you the gift and the privilege and the responsibility to disciple your kids. And we know that our role is to come alongside of you and to help you and to guide and do whatever you need in accomplishing what God has put before you. And the cool thing, and one of the privileges we have here at 7 Marks, is to have someone on our team whose primary role and responsibility is to walk alongside of students and parents. And so Caleb, as our student ministry pastor, he lives in this world. He researches it. He meets with other student ministry pastors around our city. He hangs with families that are going through difficult times. And so, Caleb, just talk about this from your perspective as a student ministry pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. And first, you might be sitting there, and some of you are already checked out because you're like, I don't have a biological family. I don't have a nuclear family. But I want to encourage you to guard against that today. Because what we're about to say about family discipleship, I think, goes perfectly in line with how we've defined family in this series, right? Jesus said, we mentioned this in week 2 of the series, anyone who does God's will is my family. And so for some of you, it could be friends or a church family, roommate, a coworker, could be your boss, it could be just people that you do life with. And so I want to encourage you, whoever you define family as, put them in mind as we walk through some practical ways to look at family discipleship. And you might have to get creative when it comes to this because majority of us sitting around this table are in a season of our lives where we have kids. And so some of our primary examples today will be specific to that. But I want to encourage you, if it's not a kid at home or a spouse, and maybe it's a neighbor or a coworker, be creative in how you can take these principles but yet still apply it to your context. And maybe even for you, you're a group leader, a 7 Marks group leader here, and think of ways that next time you as a church family gather around the table, you can use some of these ideas and help your group out as well. But it's very interesting, and you might not know this, but God's actually pretty specific when he talks about family discipleship. And a lot of times we often overlook it because it's in the Old Testament, and sometimes we want to fast forward through that, if I'm being honest, right? But he actually introduces family discipleship, not as a program, but as a way of life. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says this, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your vitality. And these words I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children or your spouse or your neighbor. And you shall talk about them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and when you lie down and when you rise."
Yeah, Caleb, if I can just interrupt
Yeah.
for a moment, because I care deeply about this whole idea of discipleship as a way of life. Some of you will have recognized that passage that Caleb just read as the Shema, and Jewish people have prayed this prayer for thousands of years, and it begins with the very strong exhortation to listen or hear. In the Hebrew, listening and hearing and obeying are really the same word, has kind of the same meaning. And so, when I talk to my kids and I'm like, hear me, listen to me, what I'm expecting is some obedience to follow. And the same is true with God. As he's saying in this passage, listen, hear me, I am the living God, and I desire that you follow me and that you love me with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And not only that, but that you pass it on to your children in an all of life, sort of as you go kind of way. And what's so cool about this is that Jesus actually had something to say about that in the Great Commission, this idea of discipleship on the go. And he says in Matthew 28, go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. And here's what I want you to notice. So we often translate that word go in the imperative sense, go. But it actually has this ongoing action that accompanies it. So we could actually better translate it, as you go, make disciples. So as you are carpooling, and as you are working, and as you are mothering, and as you are cooking, make disciples on the go. And here's the reason that I bring up the Great Commission, because this is really neat. Some scholars have actually noted that when Jesus introduced the Great Commission, Matthew 28, just before his ascension, what he was actually doing, it was a recapitulation or a recapturing of the ball that was dropped in the Garden of Eden. See, God initially gave the Great Commission to Adam and Eve. And if you don't believe me, watch this, Genesis 1:28. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. See, the command there was to be fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth. And listen, had humans done what we were designed to do, the earth would have been filled with billions of little sinless image bearers of God doing what they were created to do, to worship and obey, and to do it perfectly. And that was God's original intention. And so my encouragement to you, if you're a mom or dad or grandparent, educator, whoever you are sitting in this room, God desires that you leverage the as you go, on the go, everyday rhythm of life discipleship for where you live, work, study, play, and shop.
Yeah, and I think Matt Chandler and Andy Griffin in a book called Family Discipleship, I think they hit it right on the head. And everything I've learned from and about following Jesus is something I want to pass along to you to the best of my ability. And that's how, we go back to Deuteronomy in chapter 4, we even hear this, only take care and keep your soul diligently, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, unless you depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. And this is very crucial, because part of the way we remember the Lord and how we honor him in all of our lives is simply by passing along our love for him to others, especially the next generation. And discipleship, in a sense, what it does, it keeps us honest, right? It holds us accountable. We got to actually report to someone, responsible to someone. And if we don't, it's more likely that we'll forget what God has done for us. And it's certainly, that the next generation will. And we continue to look in Deuteronomy in chapter 6 and following. It says, and in the future, when your son asks, what is the meaning of your decrees and statutes and ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you, then you are to tell them, we were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before our eyes, the Lord inflicted great and devastating signs and wonders on Egypt, on Pharaoh, and all of his household. And he brought us out from there to lead us in and give us the land they had sworn to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes and to fear the Lord our God, that we may always be prosperous and preserved as we are to this day. And if we are careful to observe every one of these commandments before the Lord our God as he commanded us, then that will be our righteousness. Let me break it down, right? What this is saying is God is telling the Israelites, hey, listen, there's going to come a day when your children will wonder why you observed the Torah the way you did, right? And they will be observing the way you lived, the things that you valued, your practices, your priorities. And then they're going to ask you, what's up with all of this? Like, why? And the response will be, because the Lord our God is great. And he has done great things. He has been faithful to us. That's family discipleship. Like plain and simple. Communicating what God has done to you. Now, kind of fast forward. People are watching you and I every day. Your children, your coworkers, your spouse, your bosses, your neighbors. And they're going to see your habits and your values and your priorities and your practices. And they're going to ask you, what is up with all of that? You see the correlation, right? And here, let me just add this. I think this is a key thing for our next generation. That they're not going to ask you what, they're going to ask you why. And if you grew up like me, you never asked your dad why, right? Because it was because I said so. And that was it in the story. But for this younger generation, listen, they genuinely want to know why. And it's not disrespectful, right? Some of us would view that disrespectful. And I get it, there's some cases where it might be. But they genuinely care about why. And what better response of, let me tell you about Jesus. Let me show you how Jesus has impacted my life. Because that's a faith your kid, your neighbors, your coworkers, your bosses want to grab a hold of. And I think Tony Evans, once again, I think he hits it on the head. He says the single greatest reason why we're losing our young people today is that the home is no longer the place where faith is transferred. Parents, the primary purpose of your home is the evangelization and discipleship of your children. You cannot outsource this vital component in rearing of your children. And parents, here's the reality. You have over 3,000 plus hours with your kid. And me and our small group leaders, who are awesome, by the way, and if you ever want to invest in the next generation, just let me know. We get maybe an hour, and I'm probably being generous with that in a year. And so I want to encourage you. You are the primary discipler of your kid. I don't want to take that role. I don't want to hijack that from you. But what we want to do is come alongside you and equip you and resource you and walk with you. We would love to. And let's be honest, as a parent, as a follower of Jesus, we just like Jesus, we want to get it right. And we want to have our faith lived out so people notice. But the reality is, when I talk to most parents and when I talk to most individuals, we just don't know how. Or we're just not confident in doing it.
That's true. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. But before we get really practical, I want Josh to talk a little bit about it, like what it looks like in your house. Because of all of us around this table, you have the biggest laboratory at your house, right? You have like 100 kids, and so
Yeah, something like that.
So talk about it like real time. What does it look like at your house?
Yeah, laboratory is a great word because I feel like we're in this giant social experiment every day trying to figure it out. But yeah, so Tasha and I really try to leverage the table for meaningful discipleship. And I love quotes. We have this quote from Charles Spurgeon over our table. It says, may you walk with Jesus as Enoch did, and so may your homes become temples, meals become sacraments, days become Sabbaths, and earth become heaven. And that's truly what Tasha and I desire for our family. So, so kind of here's what our mealtime looks like. Just in a general way, we have this 10-foot farm table that Tasha and I built, just so that we could actually have more people over, because when our family wouldn't even fit at this table right here.
Right.
So
Sorry about that.
yeah, so we gather, and every meal I'll try to encourage a different kid to open in prayer and just sort of help them flex that muscle a little bit. And then we'll go around the table and I'll have them share like a high and a low. And let me just time out and say, Tasha and I don't have this figured out, and Paul sort of hit on this earlier. None of us are experts. we're trying to figure it out on the fly, right? So don't imagine that our table is like our kids are like perfectly behaved and hands in laps and the hair perfect and the corduroy and polo. It's not that. It's thank you. So we're trying to figure it out. But we go around the table, we do highs and lows, and sometimes that helps spark further conversation. And then usually I'll ask, okay, guys, like how did you see God working today? Or what did you see God do? Because I want them to start to recognize the activity and hear the voice of God in everyday life. I mean, I just do. And so normally I'll ask that question. A lot of times it'll be crickets, or diversion. They'd rather talk about who farted at the table and that kind of thing. But I'm like, all right, let's reel it in. And so I'll usually have to have a story to start to spur them on a little bit. And it's really good accountability for myself. So as I'm walking through the day, I'm trying to pay attention to what is God doing? How have I seen him working? Because I want to be able to pass that down to my children. And I saw my dad model that so well. We would sit down for a meal and he would share, about a gospel conversation he had or how he saw God working. And so it really creates great accountability for all of us. So my encouragement to you guys, again, as parents, grandparents, some of you are not parents, but you're educators or you have some influence into the next generation. My encouragement to you would be simply to be intentional with that time. Like you don't have to have a ton of time and you don't need to have this completely scripted, program. I would just encourage you to just be intentional with it. Because here's the thing, like your kids are probably picking up more than you realize as long as you're being intentional with that. And here's the other thing I would encourage you to do is simply live out what you proclaim, right? Because the truth is they're going to forget probably 99% of what you say when they grow up. But they will remember 100% of your actions that are inconsistent with what you proclaim from your lips. You hearing me? So let's live out what we proclaim. And let's recapture, as I mentioned earlier, let's recapture the ball that was dropped in the Garden of Eden and pass on a faith that is replicable to the next generation.
Yeah. I believe that we all want that, not just us around this table, but I believe we all want that online, in the room. But as we stated, like wanting something, even knowing it, is one thing. Right? But doing it is a completely different thing. And so, and every family's different. We have different dynamics. And so what we wanted to do with the remaining time is, again, get really practical. And most of the stuff that we'll share moving forward is going to come from this book, Family Discipleship, by Matt Chandler and Adam Griffin. And so you can get this. But we're making the case that the discipleship of your family should be the single most thing, the single most priority in your family. What could be more important? And so in order for that to happen, it's gonna require a couple things, right? One of the habits or practices we've been talking about is getting around the table. And as Tyler mentioned earlier, getting around the table, then it has the possibility of unleashing a lot of other good things in life just by getting around the table. But there's more than the table. And Chandler and Griffin talk about these three things: time, moments, and milestones. First, time, or sacred rhythms. And they define it as this: creating intentional time built into the rhythm of the family's life for the purpose of thinking about, talking about, and living out the gospel. So last week we talked about hospitality being both proactive and reactive in nature. So time is this proactive idea, with the keystone habit being the family meal. And so we want to encourage you to make this a big deal at your house. All right, so how do we do that? Just take an incremental step wherever you are. Let's say you don't practice this at all at your house. Well, then this next week, try and do one meal. Or if you do one meal, then add a meal. Or maybe you eat in front of the TV, shut the TV off. Or maybe you have your phones or your devices on the table. Put your phones or device in another spot. Whatever, like just take one incremental step around the table and making the table purposeful. And it's just not the table. It could be other things. It could be your commute to and from school, or it could be family prayer time, or it could be any number of things. And the point is to make the regular rhythm of your life more purposeful, like Josh said, and more intentional. You guys want to share like an example? Okay.
So for us, from the beginning, I have a 3-year-old and a 1-year-old, and we really wanted to emphasize God's word and spending time with prayer. And part of also sleep habits is if you create a rhythm right before bedtime, it pays off. And so we're like, oh, perfect, sleep and Jesus, right? Great things. So at night, we started with our daughter. We already had a routine, and we read this. I highly recommend this. If you have kids, it's the Jesus Story Bible. And the cool thing is they tell Old Testament stories, but it points to Jesus. Even if maybe you're new to the faith and you're like, the Bible's hard, hey, this does an excellent job in communicating stories. Tyler was telling me about how he recommends that sometimes to new believers. So if you don't have this, I'd recommend it. And so before bed, we would read a story from the Bible, and we would pray. And of course, now my son won. He's not praying with us. But my daughter will, now that she's 3 and we've been doing it for a few years, she'll begin to pray. And it's really beautiful to hear some honest and beautiful prayers. And even this past week, our kids' ministry is phenomenal. And she's like, I learned about Jonah. Dad, can we turn to Jonah and read about it? And I was like, absolutely. But we just wanted to communicate, hey, prayer is important. And when we started the Bless Every Home here at 7 Marks, we would prayer walk our neighborhood with our kids. And Haven would be like, I pray for the Purple House, and I pray for that lady walking the dog. Really honest prayers. And some nights we wouldn't be able to get back to a walk. And so we would pray for our neighbors right before bed. And some nights she would pray for literally all of our neighbors by name because she's so spiritual, of course. Or maybe she just wanted to prolong bedtime. I don't know which one it is. I'm going to say it's because she's super spiritual. But don't get me wrong. It's really, really cool. Really cool to hear your daughter pray for people by name. And it's just a simple habit that we start is, like, it's really important to strategize and to plan times for your family to do this. Because if you don't, it will slip away. And even sometimes, though, man, like, just like you were saying, just rhythms in your life. We're not trying, not necessarily asking you to create anything new, but just be intentional with adding Jesus to what you're already doing, which kind of goes into the next component.
Right, which are moments. So you have time and you have moments. So where time would be the proactive aspect, moments are reactive. And so when there are certain things that happen more spontaneously in your life, then you take advantage of that. For example, if you see something spectacular and you immediately move that conversation to the bigness of God or His sovereignty or a character quality of God, and you begin to speak about that, or you see somebody demonstrating something, some attribute or some attitude or maybe an act to where they were honest, and you're able at that moment to take advantage of speaking into that moment God's movement or what's true about God or the gospel, or here's a great one, 7 marks, right? So it is understanding what the 7 marks are, and so I'm going to make a little plug here. So out on the kiosk when you leave are these little cards, and so when we first talked about a name change here, we talked about the opportunity you have when somebody says, well, what about 7 marks? And you're able to just run down through, well, here's the 7 marks. So on the back of this card, you have all 7 marks that you'll be able to understand. So when it occurs in your week to where you see one of these marks being illustrated or being demonstrated, you're able to speak to that mark with your kids or your family or your community here. So all of those are opportunities. And so Tyler, you were relating to me an opportunity that you take advantage of every day, even though your daughter's very young, that you started with her. So talk about that.
Yeah, and it happens around the table. So one of the things that we've realized, and this kind of goes back to Josh, what you were saying about this whole idea of as you go discipleship. Well, like most of you, most of those really reactive, valuable, unexpected discipleship moments are happening when we're on the go, but not together. And so I became really interested in trying to figure out a way to kind of redeem those moments around our table. And how do we have somewhat natural conversations that maybe lend themselves to us identifying and then capitalizing on some of those spiritually valuable moments. And so we started using this thing called an emotions wheel, and it's exactly like it sounds. It's a wheel we put up on our fridge right by our table, and it's got a variety of different colors to represent different emotions and a bunch of different emotion words, and they're kind of all layered and nuanced on each other. And so we use it almost every single day now, and it's really simple. When we sit down for dinner, one of the first things we do is say, all right, pick out 3 emotion words that were significant for you today, and let's just talk about it for a few minutes. And I like it for a few reasons. First, it gets us out of the, how was your day? Busy. How was yours? Good. Rut that we tend to fall into. Second, it keeps us from just downloading the content or the details of the day without actually making ourselves known to one another. Third, and maybe this is a Tyler thing, maybe this is a guy thing, I don't know, but my emotion words kind of go from happy to frustrated. Those are about the only 2 words I have in my vocab. And so the emotion wheel helps me be a little bit more emotionally intelligent, a little bit more nuanced in my own self-understanding and my understanding of my family. It's really helpful knowing that today you felt betrayed or respected, that you felt worried or confident, that you felt shocked or fulfilled. And then having a chance to talk about the people or the situations that gave rise to those emotions, that is valuable, valuable information. And so we have just found that by doing that on a regular basis, we're able to unpack and contextualize some of those most important moments that lend themselves to really great spiritual conversations and practicing the way of Jesus together.
I love that. It's just like so simple, but I hope you heard like how intentional that is and how moving away from where we all have this tendency of these one-word answers. You know, I know, so Martha works at home, and I use up a lot of my words during the day. She does not. So when I come home, it's important that I go beyond the one-word answers, right, to her when we're around the table. So it's intentional. And so we have time, we have moments, and then this last category that Chandler and Griffin call milestones. And it's marking and making occasions to celebrate and commemorate significant spiritual milestones of God's work in the life of your family. So it's marking, it's stopping and recognizing the work of God, but it's also, on the other hand, making, like it's creating these moments, these milestones for your family. And it could be everything from, I mean, we all go through holidays and birthdays and significant accomplishments in life, and it's stopping to understand that. And so, Josh, you recently did something with your daughter, and I think you want to do it with all your kids, but talk about that.
Yeah, so a few years ago, my wife Tasha and I, we read 2 books, Raising a Modern Day Knight and Raising a Modern Day Princess. And in there, the authors talk about leveraging these milestone events like birthdays with intentionality, and they encourage rites of passage kind of ceremonies. And so we thought we would give it a try. So when Rainey turned 13, and then 2 months ago when she turned 16, and then Zeke, when he turned 13, we had these rites of passage ceremonies where we invited their friends to a party, and then we surrounded them with adult mentors in their life who could speak into their life and really try to speak some value, affirm what God is doing in their lives. And it was really impactful. You know, Rainey's was definitely a princess kind of theme, and Zeke's had like swords and knives involved.
Of course.
So it was really, really neat. So we definitely want to do that with all of our children.
Love it. I love this quote from this book as we kind of wind down here. Your faith is your children's best possible inheritance. I know Martha and I have worked hard for kind of the physical inheritance of our kids, and we are challenged to continue to apply more effort to the spiritual inheritance of our kids, because that's what lasts for all eternity. All eternity. And so, as we discovered over these past 7 weeks, biblical hospitality is easier said than done, right? For nearly 2 months, some of you are like, man, I'm so glad we're done this. But for nearly 2 months, man, we've been talking about this in our busy, modern world, where, man, this is like, it doesn't happen as frequently as it should. But it's so important. It's so important. We've been talking about the role that the table played in the teaching and life of Jesus, and how it makes and shapes the church into a family, right? And how it brings strangers that are in our midst to become friends. It turns them into friends, and then it turns friends into the family of God. And how this table, sitting around this table, can be a place where we can disciple one another to a life that, a life of following Jesus that goes deep and that's genuine, and that we can pass on to those that are around us, that will maybe be able to stand up against the rigors of this post-Christian world. And here's the amazing thing, at least to us. It doesn't take a graduate degree. It doesn't take some kind of grand plan or some kind of outrageous strategy. It just takes a little bit of time and intentionality. It takes some vulnerability and some openness and just a little bit of effort. Just a little bit of effort and a few people around your table.